John had arrived at the airport early, something he prided himself on. He liked to be the first in line, the first to settle into his seat, and the first to enjoy the perks of first-class comfort. He wasn't a man to settle for less, and after years of building his career, clawing his way up the corporate ladder, he felt he deserved this luxury. As he approached the first-class gate, he flashed his ticket with a confident smile. The attendant greeted him warmly, accustomed to the type of passenger who frequented this section of the plane. The flight was bound for New York, and it was a busy morning. Business travelers like John were interspersed with a few families, the kind who might have saved up for a special trip. The line for boarding economy was growing longer, but John barely noticed it. He stepped briskly through the jetway and into the familiar serene oasis of first class. He loved this part: the spacious seats, the wide armrests, the attentive service. He took his place by the window, propped his expensive leather briefcase on the floor, and settled back, feeling the tension in his shoulders ease. He was already engrossed in his phone, responding to a few last-minute emails before takeoff, when he sensed a shadow over him. He looked up briefly, expecting to see a flight attendant or perhaps a fellow businessman. Instead, standing in the aisle was a woman in uniform. She was tall, with a strong, athletic build, and she wore the dark green dress uniform of the U.S. Army. Her short, neatly braided hair framed a serious but calm face, one marked with subtle lines of experience. She looked like someone who had seen a lot, perhaps too much. The name tag on her chest read Williams. John's eyes flicked to her boarding pass as she glanced down, checking her seat assignment. It was the aisle seat next to his. He felt an immediate flash of irritation. He couldn't quite put his finger on why, but something about this woman being here in first class didn't sit right with him. He shot her a quick, dismissive glance and shifted his position, as if to subtly block her path. Williams gave a polite, professional smile, the kind of smile that doesn't quite reach the eyes but is meant to be disarming. "Excuse me," she said, her voice steady but gentle. She gestured to her seat. John didn't budge. Instead, he looked her up and down in a way that made it clear he was assessing her. "I think you're in the wrong section," he said coolly, raising an eyebrow. His voice carried a tone that implied he was doing her a favor by pointing this out. He gave a half smile, almost as if this were an amusing misunderstanding. William's smile faltered only slightly, but her eyes didn't waver. "This is my seat," she replied, holding up her boarding pass as proof. John didn't even glance at the pass. He merely pointed his thumb over his shoulder toward the back of the plane. "Coach is that way," he said flatly. He let out a small, condescending laugh. "These seats are for people who've earned them," he added, as if the uniform she wore was nothing more than a costume. There was a brief, tense silence. John expected her to argue, maybe raise her voice or call over a flight attendant. Instead, she looked at him with a level gaze, almost as if she were studying him. For a moment, he felt like she could see right through him, as if she knew every thought running through his head. But Williams didn't take the bait. She gave a small nod, as though she had made a decision, then quietly slid into her seat without saying another word. John huffed, turning back to his phone. He tried to focus on his emails, but he couldn't shake the feeling of unease. He had expected a reaction, maybe even a scene, but she had simply ignored him. It was unsettling, almost like she had dismissed him entirely. As the flight attendants moved through the cabin, checking on passengers and securing the overhead bins, John noticed the glances some of them gave toward Williams. He could see they were aware of what had just happened. One of the attendants, a young woman with a friendly face, stopped briefly by Williams's seat and offered her a drink before takeoff, a gesture John couldn't help but notice. "Would you like something before we take off, ma'am?" the attendant asked warmly. Williams shook her head with a polite smile. "No, thank you," she said quietly, returning to her book. John couldn't resist a small snort of derision, muttering just loud enough for her to hear. "Getting the special treatment, I see." Williams paused, but she didn't look up from her book. She didn't respond or acknowledge his comment. She merely turned a page, her face impassive. John felt a surge of frustration, like he was being intentionally ignored. He wanted her to react, to give him something he could latch onto. He leaned back in his seat, crossing his arms and letting out a theatrical sigh, making a show of his annoyance. The other passengers seemed blissfully unaware, absorbed in their own worlds. To them, it was just another morning flight. John was used to getting what he wanted, and part of that meant being surrounded by people like him, successful, polished, and, most importantly, deserving of the best. He couldn't understand how someone like Williams had ended up here. He glanced over at her again, taking in the uniform, the medals pinned to her chest, and the calm, steady way she carried herself. It irritated him. She seemed too at ease, too comfortable, as if she belonged here as much as he did. When the plane began to taxi, John made a point of ignoring her, turning his head sharply toward the window. He pretended to be fascinated by the passing ground crew, the luggage carts weaving through the maze of planes. But in reality, he couldn't stop thinking about her presence beside him. It felt like an affront, like something had invaded his space. As the plane lifted off, Williams leaned back in her seat and closed her eyes briefly, as if savoring the moment of ascent. John took this opportunity to glance at her again, noting the subtle wear on her uniform, the small scars on her hands. He wondered what she had seen, where she had been, but instead of feeling curiosity, he felt annoyance. It didn't fit his narrative. He had already decided she didn't belong here, and he was determined to hold on to that belief. When the seatbelt sign turned off, Williams reached into her bag and pulled out a small, worn notebook. John watched her out of the corner of his eye as she flipped it open and began writing. Her handwriting was neat, deliberate. It irritated him further. What could she possibly have to write about? He leaned back, closing his eyes, trying to focus on anything else. But then she tore a page from the notebook, folded it carefully, and slipped it into her pocket. She glanced over at him, as if sensing his eyes on her. Their gazes met for the briefest of moments. There was no malice in her expression, no anger, just a quiet, unshakable confidence. John turned away quickly, feeling a hot flush creep up his neck. He didn't know why, but that look had made him uncomfortable in a way he couldn't quite explain. He couldn't shake the feeling that she knew something he didn't, that she had seen something in him he wasn't ready to face. John decided to let it go, forcing himself to look back out of the window, determined to ignore her for the rest of the flight. He had no idea that the note she had just written, now resting quietly in her pocket, was about to change everything he thought he knew. About himself, about respect, and about the silent cost of sacrifice he could never imagine. The flight was smooth as they descended, the plane tilting slightly as it glided through the cloud cover. John barely noticed the picturesque view from his window. His mind was spinning with irritation, yet he couldn't shake the subtle disquiet he felt sitting next to Williams. There was a stiffness in his shoulders, a low hum of frustration in his chest, and he couldn't pinpoint exactly why. Maybe it was her silence, her refusal to acknowledge his jabs, or maybe it was something deeper, something he didn't want to admit to himself. He heard the pilot's voice over the intercom, announcing their approach to JFK, thanking everyone for choosing this airline, and reminding passengers to stay seated with their seatbelts fastened. John was relieved. He just wanted to get off the plane, get away from this woman who had somehow unsettled him so much with just her presence. He began gathering his things prematurely, clicking his briefcase shut and double-checking his watch as if he had somewhere important to be. Beside him, Williams tucked away her notebook into her bag, zipping it up with the same deliberate care she had shown throughout the flight. John watched her, unable to resist one last sideways glance. He noticed the way her hands moved, calm and precise. He wondered how someone could be so at peace after what he'd said, after the way he'd tried to belittle her. It irked him that she hadn't even flinched. As the plane touched down and taxied to the gate, there was a moment of stillness, that brief pause before everyone stands and begins the mad scramble for their luggage. John unbuckled his seatbelt quickly, eager to get up and make his way to the front of the cabin. He was already halfway out of his seat when he felt a light tap on his arm. He turned, ready to snap something sharp in response, but was caught off guard when he saw Williams holding out a small, folded piece of paper. Her face was calm, her expression unreadable. "Here," she said simply, offering him the note. John hesitated, staring at the paper as if it were something foreign, something dangerous. He looked up at her face, searching for a sign of what this was about, but she gave nothing away. Her eyes held his, steady and unblinking, with a softness that disarmed him more than any sharp retort could have. "Read it after we land," she added quietly, pressing the paper into his hand. Her voice was even, almost gentle, and it threw him off balance. He wanted to ask why, wanted to refuse it, but he found himself taking it, more out of surprise than anything else. He clenched the note in his fist, feeling the crumpled edges dig into his palm. Before he could say anything, William stood up, grabbed her duffel bag from the overhead bin, and stepped into the aisle. John watched her go, his mind racing. He told himself he didn't care what was on the note. It was probably some passive-aggressive response, some attempt to guilt him. He shook his head, stuffing the note into his pocket without looking at it. He'd read it when he felt like it, if he felt like it. The first-class passengers filed out, and John kept his eyes forward, avoiding the gazes of the flight attendants who had clearly witnessed the earlier exchange. He didn't want their pity or their judgment. He didn't want anyone to see that. For once he felt small. He stepped off the plane, entering the bustling terminal. The usual rush of people moving through the gates enveloped him, a sea of noise and motion that usually made him feel alive. But today, he felt disconnected from it all, as if he were watching it from a distance. He found himself moving slower than usual, almost reluctant to leave. He didn't understand why until his fingers brushed against the crumpled note in his pocket. John came to a halt near a row of chairs, away from the main stream of travelers. He took a deep breath, pulled out the note, and unfolded it slowly. It felt strangely heavy in his hands, as if the small piece of paper carried a weight he couldn't yet comprehend. He expected a scolding, a rebuke, maybe some snide comment about his behavior, but when he read the note, his heart dropped. "I paid for this seat with my own money. It was the least I could do after losing my brother in Afghanistan. He died in my arms, protecting our squad from an ambush. He died believing in this country and the freedoms we all take for granted. I thought you should know. You sat here today, comfortable and safe, because of people like him, and because of people like me, who come back with the memories that never leave. I hope this flight gave you a small glimpse into what you take for granted every day." John felt like the ground had shifted beneath his feet. He read the note again, slower this time, as if he hadn't understood it the first time. He couldn't believe what he was reading. His fingers shook, and the edges of the paper crinkled as he clenched it tighter. He looked up, scanning the crowd around him for any sign of Williams. His eyes darted from one face to another, searching desperately for her tall, broad-shouldered frame, for the flash of green uniform. But she was gone, lost in the sea of passengers. John felt a tightness in his chest like someone had reached in and squeezed his heart. He staggered over to an empty chair and sat down heavily, staring at the note in his hand. He couldn't make sense of his emotions. He felt a hot flush of shame, a wave of guilt that was almost nauseating. It was as if the entire flight, his entire interaction with her had been stripped down, laid bare in this single, stark revelation. He remembered her calm expression, the way she had looked at him. Not with anger, but with a sadness he hadn't recognized at the time. Now he understood. Now he could see it clearly. The pain she carried, the loss she had endured, the quiet strength that had been forged in moments of unimaginable suffering. He thought about her brother, a man he would never meet, who had given his life in a place far away, under circumstances John couldn't even begin to fathom. He thought about what it must have been like for her, holding her dying brother, knowing she had to keep fighting, keep going, despite the grief tearing her apart. And then he thought about his own life, the comfort, the privilege, the ease with which he had dismissed her as someone unworthy of sitting beside him. He felt sick. He had spent the entire flight judging her, resenting her presence, assuming the worst of her, and she had simply taken it, without protest, without argument. She had held her head high, letting him believe whatever he wanted, because she didn't need to prove herself to him. She knew who she was, she knew what she had given, and she knew what she had lost. The note slipped from his fingers and fluttered to the ground. He bent down slowly, picking it up with a reverence he had never felt before. He folded it carefully, smoothing out the creases as best he could, and slipped it back into his pocket, as if it were something sacred. John sat there for a long time, staring at nothing, the noise of the airport fading into the background. He felt hollowed out, as if the foundation of everything he believed about himself had been cracked open. For the first time, he saw himself clearly. The entitlement, the prejudice, the blind arrogance. He had thought he was the one who belonged in first class, that he had earned it. But now he realized, in a way that cut him to the core, that he was sitting in a seat he hadn't truly earned at all. He looked up one last time, hoping against hope that he might catch a glimpse of her, that he might get a chance to say something, to apologize, to do anything to make it right. But Williams was gone. And in her absence, she left behind a lesson he would never forget, a mirror he couldn't look away from. John knew he would carry this moment with him for the rest of his life. He knew he would never look at a soldier the same way again, never take his comfort or his privilege for granted. And as he stood up, slowly making his way toward the exit, he realized something else, something that brought tears to his eyes for the first time in years. He realized he would never be able to thank her enough. John walked slowly through the airport terminal, his pace uncharacteristically sluggish. He felt like he was moving through a fog, every step heavy with the shame he couldn't shake. The noise of the bustling crowd was just a distant hum to him now. The laughter of children, the hurried calls of gate agents, and the mechanical announcements echoing through the loudspeakers all blended into a muffled roar that barely registered. He was too lost in his thoughts, the crumpled note like a stone in his pocket. He found a small bench near a large glass window overlooking the runway. Planes were taking off and landing in a synchronized ballet, an endless cycle of departures and arrivals. John sank down onto the bench, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees, his head hanging low. He took a deep breath, but it didn't fill his lungs the way it usually did. Instead, it came out in a shaky exhale, almost a shudder. He pulled the note out of his pocket again, his fingers brushing over the crinkled edges as if smoothing them out could somehow undo the damage he'd done. He read the words slowly, letting each sentence sink in fully, letting the reality of what she had written settle over him like a heavy blanket. He pictured her brother in his mind, a man he had never met, but who now felt almost painfully real. He imagined a soldier, young and full of life, running through a dusty, sun-scorched landscape far from home, fighting to protect people he had never met. He imagined the moment of impact, the split-second decision to put himself in harm's way to save his squad. And then he imagined Williams, cradling her brother in her arms as he took his last breath, feeling his life slip away while she fought to keep her own composure. He saw her face in his mind's eye, the calm and collected mask she wore on the plane, and he realized that underneath it was a pain he couldn't even begin to comprehend. It made his chest ache, a deep, hollow feeling that gnawed at him. He thought back to the way he had treated her, the way he had dismissed her with such arrogance. He had assumed she didn't belong in first class, had believed she was out of place, without even stopping to consider why she might be there. He had seen the uniform and made assumptions, the same way he'd done countless times in his life without thinking twice. But now, the uniform wasn't just a piece of fabric to him, it was a symbol of everything she had gone through, everything she had lost. John sat there for what felt like hours, though it was only a few minutes. People moved around him, oblivious to the internal storm raging inside him. Business travelers in suits, families with children tugging at their parents' hands, teenagers glued to their phones. They all passed by without a second glance, wrapped up in their own worlds. He realized, with a sinking feeling, that he had been just like them. He had lived his life so wrapped up in his own bubble of privilege and comfort that he hadn't even noticed the sacrifices that made it all possible. The noise of the terminal began to fade back into focus as the sharp sting of his realization softened into something quieter, something deeper. It wasn't just guilt. It was a profound sense of humility he hadn't felt in years. He had spent so long building a wall around himself, a fortress made of success and material wealth, that he had forgotten what it meant to truly connect with another person's experience. He had forgotten what it meant to be vulnerable, to let down his guard and see the world through someone else's eyes. He stood up slowly, feeling like he had aged 10 years in the span of a single flight. He knew he couldn't leave without doing something, without at least trying to make amends. He made his way through the terminal with renewed purpose, searching for any sign of Williams. He scanned the crowds, looking for the familiar flash of her uniform, her strong, composed figure, but she was nowhere to be found. He felt a pang of regret, a sharp twist of disappointment in his gut. He wanted to apologize, to thank her, to say something, anything, that might convey the weight of what he was feeling. He found himself at the baggage claim area where people were gathered around, waiting for their bags to appear on the carousel. He stopped at the edge of the crowd, still searching, still hoping for one last glimpse of her. He saw business suits, summer dresses, college hoodies, and vacation shirts, but there were no military uniforms. He swallowed hard, feeling the lump in his throat tighten. He realized she was already gone, that she had slipped away as quietly and gracefully as she had endured his treatment. John stood there, feeling lost, feeling small in a way he hadn't felt since he was a child. He pulled out his phone and opened the search app, his fingers trembling slightly as he typed in "support for veterans." He had never once considered donating to a veterans organization before. It had never even crossed his mind. He scrolled through the list, his eyes catching on the names of charities that helped with PTSD, that provided support for families of fallen soldiers, that helped veterans reintegrate into civilian life. He clicked on one almost at random and filled out the donation form. He typed in an amount that made him pause. It was more than he had ever donated to anything before, but it didn't feel like enough. He could have emptied his entire bank account and it still wouldn't have felt like enough. When he hit the donate button, he felt a small, fleeting sense of relief. It was a gesture, a start, but he knew it wasn't enough to undo the way he had acted. It wasn't enough to erase the look in William's eyes when she had handed him the note, the quiet resignation of someone who had been through this kind of treatment too many times before. But it was something, and for now, it was all he could do. As he walked toward the exit, John noticed a small, quiet group gathered near the arrivals gate. They were holding handmade signs, a few balloons, and a large American flag. It was a welcome home party for a group of soldiers. The families were standing with anticipation, their faces lit up with excitement and relief. John paused, watching from a distance. He saw the soldiers appear, dressed in their uniforms, walking out of the gate with weary smiles. They were immediately enveloped by hugs, tears of joy, and laughter. The sight tugged at something deep inside him. He found himself stepping closer, almost without realizing it. He watched as a young soldier, no older than 25, was swept up into his mother's arms. She held him tight, sobbing into his shoulder, her body racked with the kind of tears that come from a place of deep relief, of a fear finally released. The soldier's face softened, and he held her just as tightly, his eyes closing as he buried his face in her hair. John's eyes stung, and he blinked rapidly, looking away. He felt a tear slip down his cheek, and he wiped it away quickly, almost angrily. He couldn't remember the last time he had cried, couldn't remember the last time he had felt something so raw and unfiltered. He turned and walked out of the terminal, the cold air hitting him like a slap to the face. He breathed it in deeply, letting it clear his head. He knew he was leaving with more than just his luggage today. He was leaving with a new understanding, a new perspective that he couldn't ignore. He had been given a gift, even if it was wrapped in the most uncomfortable of truths. John knew he would never be able to repay Williams for what she had done, not just in the war, but on that flight, in the small but powerful gesture of handing him that note. It was a reminder, a wake-up call he desperately needed, and as he walked to the taxi stand, he felt a strange, bittersweet sense of gratitude. He had been shown something that most people never get to see, something most people never understand. He had seen what true sacrifice looked like, and he knew he would carry it with him for the rest of his life. It had been several weeks since the flight, but John still couldn't get the encounter out of his mind. He found himself replaying it over and over, dissecting every moment, every look, every word exchanged. The memory of the soldier's note weighed heavily on him, a constant presence that followed him through his daily routines. He carried it in his wallet now, folded carefully, like a reminder he couldn't bear to let go of. John's life hadn't changed on the surface. He still went to work at the same high-powered corporate office in downtown Manhattan. He still navigated the daily grind with the same confidence, taking meetings, making deals, moving forward with his plans. But something inside him had shifted. It was subtle, almost imperceptible to anyone else, but to John, it felt monumental. It was as if a door had been opened, a door he didn't even know was there, and now he couldn't close it again. He began noticing things he had ignored before. On his way to work, he saw a man in a tattered camouflage jacket sitting on a bench, his face lined with exhaustion and defeat. Before, John might have walked past without a second thought, but now he found himself pausing, slipping a $20 bill into the man's hand without a word, feeling a pang of guilt that he had never stopped before. The man looked up, surprised, meeting John's eyes with a gratitude that made him feel both good and terrible at the same time. It wasn't just the small gestures, though. John found himself seeking out information he had never cared about before. He started reading articles about veterans, about the challenges they faced when they returned home, about the mental health struggles, the homelessness, the lack of support. He read about soldiers who had given everything and were now living on the streets, forgotten by the very country they had fought to protect. It filled him with a slow, simmering anger, not just at the system, but at himself, for having been so oblivious, so wrapped up in his own privilege. One Friday evening, as he was sitting at home with a glass of scotch in his hand, John found himself staring at the wall, the TV playing in the background. It was tuned to the evening news, but he wasn't really listening. His mind was elsewhere, drifting back to the look on William's face when she had handed him the note, the calmness, the quiet dignity. He realized he hadn't been able to stop thinking about her, about what she had gone through, about the brother she had lost. He pulled out his phone, hesitating for a moment before searching for veterans' events in the city. He scrolled through the list, feeling a strange tug of urgency. He needed to do something more than just donate money. He needed to face this head-on, to confront the feelings he had been wrestling with since that day. He saw an upcoming charity event for veterans, a fundraiser and recognition dinner hosted by a local nonprofit. Without thinking too much about it, he bought a ticket. The night of the event, John arrived at the venue, a large, stately hall in the heart of Manhattan. He felt out of place the moment he walked in. The room was filled with a mix of people, veterans in uniform, civilians dressed in evening attire, families of soldiers. There was a palpable sense of camaraderie in the air, a shared bond that John couldn't penetrate. He realized then how isolated he had become in his own world, how far removed he was from the experiences of the people in this room. He wandered through the crowd, stopping at the various booths set up by different organizations supporting veterans. He listened to their stories, feeling a growing sense of humility. There were men and women here who had lost limbs, who had seen horrors he couldn't even imagine, yet they spoke with a kind of hope and resilience that left him speechless. As he made his way to the back of the room, he saw her. Williams was standing with a small group of people, talking and laughing softly. She was dressed in a simple, elegant dress, a departure from the uniform he had seen her in. But there was no mistaking her. She still carried herself with that same quiet confidence, that same strength. John felt his breath catch in his throat. He had come here hoping he might see her, but now that he did, he wasn't sure what to do. He stood there for a moment, feeling like a child who had been caught doing something wrong. He wanted to turn around, to leave before she saw him, but then she looked up, and their eyes met. For a brief second, there was no recognition on her face, just the polite, distant smile of someone greeting a stranger. But then her expression softened and she nodded slightly, as if she knew why he was there. John took a deep breath and walked over, his hands shaking slightly. He felt exposed, vulnerable in a way he hadn't felt in years. "Hi," he managed to say, his voice sounding strange in his own ears. William smiled, a small, understanding smile. "Hello," she replied, her tone kind but neutral. She looked at him for a long moment, as if she were sizing him up, trying to gauge what had brought him here. "I wanted to say thank you," John blurted out, the words tumbling out awkwardly, "for what you wrote, for everything. I was wrong. I judged you, and I had no right. I'm so sorry." William studied him, her expression softening further. She gave a small nod. "Apology accepted," she said simply. There was no anger in her voice, no lingering resentment. It was as if she had already moved past it, had already forgiven him before he even asked. John felt a wave of relief, but it was tinged with something deeper, something more profound. He realized that her forgiveness wasn't just for him. It was a choice she had made for herself, a way to carry on without the weight of bitterness. It humbled him even more. "I kept your note," he said, pulling it out of his wallet. He unfolded it carefully, smoothing out the creases. "I've read it 100 times. It changed the way I see things. It changed the way I see people." Williams glanced down at the note, then back up at him. "Sometimes it takes a small reminder," she said softly, her voice gentle, "to see the world differently." John nodded, feeling a tightness in his chest. He wanted to say more, wanted to express the depth of his gratitude, the extent of his transformation, but he didn't know how to put it into words. Instead, he reached out a hand and she took it, her grip firm and steady. "Thank you," he said again, his voice thick with emotion. She gave his hand a squeeze before letting go. "Take care of yourself," she said, and there was something in her eyes that looked like understanding, like she knew exactly what he was feeling. John watched as she walked away, back to her group of friends. He felt a strange mix of sadness and hope. He knew he might never see her again, but he also knew that she had left an indelible mark on his life. She had shown him a truth he had been blind to, had opened his eyes in a way no one else ever had. As he left the event that night, John stepped out into the cold air, feeling lighter than he had in years. He took a deep breath, looking up at the night sky, the stars barely visible against the city's bright lights. He felt a small, fleeting sense of peace, a feeling that he was on the right path, even if he had taken a long time to find it. For the first time, he understood what real sacrifice meant. And he knew that he had been given a chance to start again, to live with more empathy, with more gratitude. It was a gift he would never forget, and he vowed silently to himself that he would honor it every day, in every small way he could. Because respect wasn't something you earned with money or power. It was something you gave, freely and fully, to those who had earned it through their actions, through their sacrifices, through the quiet, unspoken strength of simply carrying on.